Sup bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Grimasaur and at Mort_post for official announcements. Hello lovelies. The English Civil War. It's an incredibly interesting period in British history and in global history. That's part of the reason I chose to set Whitechester in at least some analogue of that period, to have it sort of situated in that kind of situation and idea. Here we have the king, who was perhaps possibly a papist when the Church of England had been established, and so wasn't really representing the country, who was extremely excessive, authoritarian, blithered away a lot of money on frivolous things, and was seen as a bit of a lush, a bit unchristian in the way in which he conducted himself. Because Charles II would be the same, but Charles I, yeah, and that kind of went against the mood of the people in the country. This was a time when Puritanism was pretty ascendant, along with several other slightly odd religious sects, and where a lot of early sort of socialist ideas were bubbling up from below, where you have the Levellers and the Diggers and all of these other quite radical groups, often tied together with more radical forms of Protestant Christianity as well. So it's a fascinating period. It's not one I've studied intently, but it's one I'm interested in. It's a period in which Britain is, well, England really, is simultaneously extremely primitive and backward looking and authoritarian in terms of its religion, but the war drives a huge amount of technological innovation, military innovation, effective tactics, social reform to an extent, though Cromwell let us all down. You know, there's a lot there that's fascinating, and then even the Restoration, which comes afterwards. You know, the office of the king is never really the same ever after. It remains something more muted. Still influential, but from that point onwards, really, it's the government that's ascendant rather than the monarch, which puts us in a position for the constitutional monarchy that we have today. It kind of delays Britain's Renaissance in a lot of ways, but then when it does come flooding back with the Restoration, it's all the more powerful for it, and places Britain at the forefront of science, the Enlightenment, and everything else, along with the burgeoning empire that came with it. So it is an absolutely fascinating period in history for so many reasons: political, social, technological, military, you name it. And it's also a time of great superstition through the influence of the Puritans. So that's why I set Whitechester in sort of that period. And it's also why I was quite excited and interested when I got this in the mail some time ago now. England Upturn'd for Lamentations, the Flame Princess. The cover is lovely, as all of Lamentations stuff is, and it's supposed to directly address the English Civil War. But if you're looking for a supplement about the English Civil War, or you want a real sense of what it's like, or you want a quality product, I'm afraid this isn't it. I'm saying that as someone who got a free copy, which wasn't sent to me to review, but still, this isn't what I was looking for at all when it comes to addressing this period, unfortunately. Alright, let's try and be fair about this, right? It does advertise itself in extremely small print as an adventure. So what do we actually get here? It's roughly A5 in size, it's about 128 pages. There's lots of illustrations. That's not necessarily a good thing, as we'll get into in a minute. There's a very, very short explanation on what the English Civil War was. probably more time should have been spent on that and situating the adventure within the English Civil War and talking about the technology and the superstitions of the time and various important events and so on. There's a brief description of where and when all of this takes place. There's a short introduction for the referee or dungeon master, whichever terminology you want to use, and then it's almost all adventure. There are brief explanations of arms and armour at the end, but it doesn't really go into enough detail, I don't think. And it talks about alignments, which weirdly is where they bring up the various political movements, like the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters, and those. And it does talk about religion during the English Civil War, which was very important and drove a great deal of it. So there are bits and pieces of what could have been, but the bulk of it is taken up with an adventure. I don't think it should have been an adventure. I think it should have been a setting book. That would be far more interesting and exciting and far more value for money, with perhaps a few adventure seeds or set pieces, something like that. But unfortunately, that's not what you get. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with having an adventure book with added value. It's just that there's not enough of the added value, and the adventure itself is not particularly well situated within the Civil War. In many ways, it's a standard fantasy adventure with a few Civil War trappings and motivations and so on around it. It contains things like some sort of bog beast, right? If you're going for veracity, if you're going for suspension of disbelief, and you're setting a game in a historical period, then I think your fantasy elements need to be a bit more subtle or better explained than they are in here. But it contains fantasy elements such as that, such as fairies, various other bits and pieces. Now, these were beliefs of the common folk at the time, perhaps not the bog beast, but certainly witchcraft. That would have been more suitable to put in here. People believed all kinds of weird and horrible things about the Jews and about Catholics at the time. You could have cashed in on some of that. Witches, sabbats, and Satanism and these kind of things. That would have made more sense. Or even putting people in of the old religion to be mistaken for satanic witches and so on. That would have been more in keeping. The whole witch hunter vibe really fits this period as well. But that's not what you really get, nor do you really delve into something like, say, ritual magic and so on, though there are aspects of that in the adventure. So the adventure just seems to play out like any other somewhat slightly more muted gonzo fantasy adventure, and the whole Civil War setting feels more like a bit of a sideline. A lot of it will not come up if you play. You can just play this straight as a kind of early modern fantasy game, and in fact I think the adventure will go better if you do, because people won't have the expectations of historicity and suspension of disbelief and so on that go along with it when you talk about doing something historical. So I'm afraid I find the adventure portion virtually worthless, unfortunately, and the bits that are promising are not long enough. So like the explanation of the Civil War isn't long enough. The arms and armour section's not long enough. The reaction and persuasion and alignment and religion sections, these aren't long enough, and they feel kind of crude. Why would your religious affiliation or your political affiliation reflect itself necessarily in your alignment? I mean, Stalin was a communist, right? But there are lots of people who were communists who are wonderful, amazing people. But there's also Stalin. So the politics doesn't necessarily jive there. And there were a lot of people involved in the parliamentarian side who really, really did want to democratise Britain, radically, well ahead of what anyone else was really doing at the time. A lot of the soldiers who fought for Parliament fought on the basis of the idea that the franchise would be extended to men like them. and it wasn't, and there was a revolt by the soldiers after the Civil War about that. It just kind of goes to show, Cromwell claimed to be fighting for Parliament and democracy and broadening the franchise and doing all these wonderful things, and then was pretty much a despot once he took over and tried to establish his own sort of line of succession. As always happens, it seems, in these kind of revolts, they're vulnerable to takeover by an arsehole with a lot of power. So bits like that just don't make sense. Presentation-wise, it's very basic, very simple, which is fine. I'm a fan of that. I think that being too fiddly is not good. But the artwork, perhaps some of this is in stark contrast to the cover, which is really good, but the interior artwork is just god-awful. I'm not saying that to be mean. It would be perfectly functional in a fanzine, or if you were going for something really, really old school looking, because a lot of the illustrations and that, while they had their charm, were very amateurish in a lot of the early TSR products and so on. But it's just awful. And I keep staring at it and trying to figure out whether it's intentionally awful or not, because there are touches of it that look like woodcuts. And if that's what they were going for, that would have been a good thing, I think, because if you look at propaganda and paperwork and artwork and so on from the English Civil War period, a lot of it is extremely crude. Woodcut prints that don't bear much resemblance to anything or anyone human. Very, very crude, almost outsider art sort of style drawings. So if they'd gone for that full bore, then it would have been in keeping and would have enhanced the book a great deal. But instead, we have what looks like someone's sketchpad doodles, while they're in history class or whatever, which is a style that can be good. But here it's neither one thing nor the other, and that brings the presentation down a huge amount. And it's really unfortunate. The cover's really promising. The interior art is terrible. It should have decided what it was going for. I think they were going for a woodcut look, because some of it is a bit more that way inclined. That's like a frontispiece from a period book. But if that's what it's meant to be, it's not crude enough, and it's just not good enough to carry itself as art otherwise. I mean, look at that hand holding that pistol. It's just terrible. Look, I don't need to be mean or pick on the artist. This style, I think, can be suited to some things. It's just not suited here, and I really think they should have gone for the woodcut look. There's not a lot else to be said, really. It's massively disappointing. And that's kind of upsetting. If I'd bought it, I would be even more upset. But I did get it for free, as I said. But if you think that influenced this towards a good review, I think you've got another thing coming. Marks. Style 2. Substance. Most of it's the adventure, which isn't that useful. There's a scattering of bits and pieces that are useful, but not enough to justify the cover price. So 2. So that's 4 out of 10 or 2 out of 5 stars. Not recommended, but I do really love the cover, and I like the potential that's here but isn't realised. Zang.
Sure, you could play one of those hoity-toity horror games where the most horrifying thing that happens is someone wearing a corset who really shouldn't. Or you could grind a zombie's face into a belt sander.
And this is not a time to be dismayed. This is punk rock time. This is what Joe Strummer trained you for. It is now time to go. You're a good person. That means more now than ever.